But in celebration of World Oceans Month, we brought together today 4 ocean experts from across the Dal science community. And today's conversation is going to focus on the impacts of ocean noise and how it is affecting marine species. And it's a great pleasure today for me to welcome today's moderator, Dr. Fred Whoriskey, who is the Executive Director of the Ocean Tracking Network. So over to you, Fred.
Thank you very much, Chris. And I would be remiss if I didn't thank you for everything that you have done to push the ocean sciences sector forward at Dalhousie University during your tenure as dean. I also don't want to be remiss and forget to thank Jocelyn Adams, the Faculty of Science alumni and donor relations officer, without whom this wouldn't be happening. She has really made it all and come together and brought it together. One bit of administration before we start for all of you who are attending, and we thank you very much for your presence. Please make sure you're muted and that your cameras are off. This will avoid the inevitable technical problems that happen on a Teams meeting when we don't do that kind of thing. In terms of myself, Fred Whoriskey, I'm the Executive Director of the Ocean Tracking Network. In my role there, I oversee this National Science Facility, a Canadian Foundation for Innovation Major Sciences Initiative, headquartered at Dalhousie University, but operating globally using electronic telemetry systems to track the movements and survival of marine animals. For me personally, I'm trained as a marine scientist, marine biologist primarily, work mostly on fishes. Most of my time is spent making sure the Ocean Tracking Network works to Dalhousie's satisfaction now, and all the paperwork associated with that. I sneak out on weekends to tag an occasional shark or torpedo ray. It is now my pleasure to begin presenting the panel members. We have 3, Dr. Lindy Weilgart, Hansen Johnson, and Haley Welsh. All of these are scholars with connections to Dalhousie University. So rather than me introducing them, we've decided to let them introduce themselves. So Lindy, could we start with you with a brief description of who you are and what you think is important in what you do?
Hi, Lindy Weilgart. Yeah, I am a alumna of Dalhousie. Did my PhD here on sperm whale communication, acoustic communication, and then sort of got sidetracked in the underwater noise impacts area, and have been doing that for almost 30 years, I think, and it's all I do. And I work in a lot of international fora like the UN and associated conventions like the Convention on Migratory Species, Convention on Biodiversity, and so on. So that's me.
Great. Thank you very much. Hansen, over to you.
Hi, thank you, Fred. My name is Hansen Johnson. I'm a PhD candidate here at Dalhousie University right now in the Oceanography department under the supervision of Dr. Chris Taggart. My PhD work is focused on the acoustic behavior and habitat of the North Atlantic right whale and other large whale species in the Northwest Atlantic. And I've been doing this work for just about 6 years now. And I'm very excited to be here talking. I'll be able to bring sort of my perspective, I think, mostly on from a baleen whale and marine mammal perspective, but I'll do my best to sort of speak broadly to the issues of noise as well.
Very good. Haley, over to you, please.
Great, thanks. Hi, everyone. Haley Welsh here. I completed my master's in marine management at Dalhousie. I was in the 2017-2018 cohort. My research then was focused on North Atlantic right whales and vessel strike mitigation measures that were implemented by Transport Canada, which is how I got into Transport Canada. So I've been working with them since 2019. As an economic policy officer. So I'm here in Ottawa, and I was brought on mostly for my previous research on southern resident killer whales and North Atlantic right whales, because those are 2 of the 3 whales identified under the Whales Initiative for the Government of Canada. So that's what I do on a day-to-day basis. For North Atlantic right whale, I'm heavily involved in the dynamic and static mandatory measures that are implemented year after year. And for SRKW, I am also working on the mitigation measures, which focuses more on the noise aspect. And I provide the marine safety and security perspective for that file. However, the region is a bit more invested in that. I also work on heavy fuel oil ban in the Arctic, emission control areas, and other environmental regulations.
Very good. Thank you very much for that. So thank you, panel, for introducing yourselves. All of these people are on the front line of a major ocean stressor. This is ocean noise. We talk a lot about global warming. We talk about overfishing. Noise is a coming stressor, one that in many respects people haven't been paying as much attention to as they should have. Just taking Haley's example, the work that Transport Canada is doing on the right whale and using things like gliders to try to identify the acoustic calls of gliders. Hansen works on this as well, is so critically important to A, the conservation of the whales by providing an early warning system so that we can try to help ships and fishing gear to avoid it, but B, for the Canadian economy, making sure that we are not harming these animals, which if we were, would close down all of our fisheries international markets when people would try to sell the fish products that were coming out of Canada for. So this is really critical. And Lindy has been on the policy side dealing with all sorts of elements of noise. So we're lucky to have them here, and we're lucky to be able to tap into their knowledge and their expertise. The way we're going to work now is I have a series of pre-prepared questions that we do want to ask to the panel. We're going to do this by first addressing a question to a specific panel member. Then we'll give the other panel members a chance to offer additional comments should they wish to do so after that. And at the end, we're going to try to preserve about 20 minutes for audience questions or audience discussion that's coming forward. So with that, we'll launch into the first question, which is directed at Hansen. And Hansen, this one is, why is sound so important to animals living out their lives in the ocean?
Yeah, this is a very broad question, a difficult one to tackle briefly, but the way that I like to think about this is sort of beginning with our own sort of collective experience as humans. We are visual creatures, and I encourage you all to think of all the ways that you rely on your vision and by extension light in the terrestrial environment to go about your daily lives. Of course, these strategies don't really work very well underwater for marine animals because light only travels a few hundreds of meters at most in the ocean before it's absorbed or scattered away. Sound, on the other hand, moves very, very efficiently underwater, much more so than light or chemical cues. So it's the furthest, it's sort of sensory modality, or it's the way that information can be transmitted furthest underwater. So as a result, many marine animals rely on sound for many essential life functions like finding food or communicating or navigating. And again, there's many different ways you could go and different examples to bring up with this particular topic. I'll bring one up that's sort of near and dear to my heart, and that's with the North Atlantic right whale. So another sort of thought experiment. Imagine you were a North Atlantic right whale and you're trying to find a mate. And there's less than 100 breeding females of North Atlantic right whales right now. And in the summer, they might be spread out anywhere between Cape Hatteras, North Carolina, and Iceland. And so if you're faced with that challenge of finding a particular mate, you really need a communication mechanism that allows you to be in touch over large distances. So the only way to do that is acoustically. And so throughout the course of this discussion, we'll talk about how these noise can compromise the ability for animals to communicate and do a lot of other essential life functions like finding food and navigating. So are there any other things that people want to add in?
Panel members?
Sorry to interrupt. If beyond the panel, if everyone could please turn their cameras off, that would be much appreciated until the Q&A period. Sorry to interrupt everyone.
That's the moderator that moderates the moderator. She's in charge of this. Very good, thank you. Lindy, maybe you want to make a comment about the kinds of animals that use sound. Is it just mammals, or do we go?
No, in fact, No, I mean, I started out studying sperm whales, but as I've gotten into this topic more, we've been working with the Food and Agriculture Organization under the UN, and fish and invertebrates and even plankton are heavily affected by noise as well. And this brings us to really, the more we look, I would be hard pressed to find any animal that does not use sound. So we started out saying, oh, let's look at the sound sensitive species. And then we were like, well, which ones are not sound sensitive? And yeah, there's very few of them. And so that means that whole ecosystem services, filter feeding and nutrient cycling, all of that is affected, which really gets to serious ecosystem issues.
All right. Going to move on to our second question. Haley, you're up. How are humans adding noise to the ocean?
How are they not? Easiest answer, I guess. Obviously, with Transport Canada, our main concerns that we've been working on obviously have to do with vessels. Increase of shipping worldwide has obviously made huge impacts in the soundscape. That and recreational vessels, from going off some of the whale research I've done, a lot of it has to do with not only the acoustic presence, but also that physical presence of the increased vessels on all three of our coasts, I would say. Other things that aren't really what I've been working on, but obviously sonar is a huge issue when it comes to the soundscape. Anything with the seismic exploration, that kind of any sort of exploration that has to do with the ocean environment. But like I said, the real one that I've been working on is the commercial and recreational vessels, whale watching vessels. And really the response that we're getting right now and how we're supposed to be managing this from a Transport Canada perspective is right now we're just kind of throwing everything at the wall and hoping it all works. It's crazy how long it takes to see results when it comes to altering sound in the environment. So from Transport, we've kind of taken it in two different ways. One is throwing the measures that we hope will work. So slowdowns, not going in certain areas, buffer distances from vessels to species, but then also looking at quiet noise initiatives. So retrofitting vessels that are coming in, any sort of upgrades, because the large impact is our commercial and recreational vessels. I don't know if my panel members want to add anything to that.
Well, that's great, Haley. I would just say that it's important to recognize that Canada is a world leader right now, Transport Canada, in trying to push for ship quieting measures, both technologically and operationally. With the slowdowns that you mentioned are a huge part in reducing noise, and have all these ancillary benefits such as reduced ship strike lethality and reduced greenhouse gases, reduced NOx and SOx emissions, and money savings as well. So that's several wins right there. But yeah, the International Maritime Organization, which regulates shipping, has just ended its Marine Environmental Protection Committee meetings, and Canada's proposal was accepted. So that's really good news that we'll get further on ship quieting this way.
Very good. Hansen?
Yeah, I can add one other thing. So Haley really nicely covered a lot of the sort of direct sources or direct ways that humans are adding noise to the ocean: shipping, seismic, construction, industry, military operations. But there's also a number of indirect ways. The main one that I'm thinking about, of course, is climate change. And so climate change can change the sort of non-anthropogenic contributions to the ocean soundscape. So reduced ice cover in the Arctic can cause increasing noise, as well as increased frequency and severity of storm events, because that also is causing noise underwater. So just to connect it back to climate change too, as we find that just about everything can be connected back to anyway.
Yep. Now, this is not to say that the ocean doesn't have periodic riots of biological noise just coming from the animals that are out there. There are times where it can be really quite overwhelming, can't it?
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Yeah. All right, move on to our third question. Lindy, you're up for this one. So what are the impacts on marine animals from human-produced sound?
Well, to start with whales, they can potentially, especially the baleen whales, they can potentially communicate over whole oceans. So anytime you raise the noise floor of the human-caused noise, it means their communication space or potential communication space just shrinks by the cubes. So that's a big one, and that's masking or obliterating sounds that they need to use. For instance, as I think Hansen mentioned, finding mates is often done acoustically, especially for animals that are very widely spread out. So that's definitely going to affect reproduction. And those are of course, the effects we're most concerned about on the welfare and health of the population. So that's a big one. And then we have stress. During 9/11, the right whales appeared to have less stress because of all the stoppage of shipping. So just when we were super stressed, they were less stressed, and thankful for the fewer ships. And but then also getting, I think I mentioned zooplankton having 2 to 3 times the mortality rates in the wake of a seismic air gun. These are to image the seafloor and to find oil and gas under the seafloor. So air guns are really, really destructive to a lot of species. And you have increases in mortality rates. And, we always thought with noise that, well, at least when you stop it, unlike chemical pollution, then the impact stops. But now we're finding that, unfortunately, the impacts can continue even up to a year, which is all that's been looked at, even after the noise has ceased. So these are in lobster reflexes, anti-predator behavior. These are mortality rates in scallops and immunocompromised status and lower nutritional condition. All of these occur months or even a year after the noise has already ceased. So, and of course, stress is a huge one across all animal groups. So those affect feeding, affect reproduction, pretty much everything, and of course, downright hearing impacts, compromising their hearing ability. Then there's of course the fatal strandings produced by the U.S. Navy mid-frequency sonar, which those can kill whales within 4 hours from hemorrhaging in the brain and heart and other vital organs. So those are a few of them.
Haley, Hansen, anybody want to add anything there?
Yeah, just to add too, so that's, yeah, absolutely, Lindy. One other thing I was thinking of as well, and it's something that we had to address really when we were developing the measures for southern resident killer whales, is a lot of the noise and the physical disturbance from vessels has whales and killer whales abandoning key foraging areas, historical foraging areas that they'd go to year after year. They're not showing up anymore. So one of the things that we kind of looked at on our end from a policy side is, okay, what were those historical foraging areas and the interim sanctuary zones that we've implemented for southern resident killer whales are historical foraging areas that we hope, there may not be high numbers right now, but we hope if it's less physical demand from vessels and the acoustics is a bit better in the areas, that they'll return and be able to hunt effectively, because obviously they depend on noise, like Hansen was saying, to hunt, to communicate, to do anything. So that's kind of like a sanctuary. It's kind of why the name came to be as well, because we're hoping that the abandoned habitats that we have, at least for the southern resident killer whales, but seen in tons of different marine species, that they'll return.
Hansen, stress.
Well, yeah. One thing I was going to mention is that we know that there are these there's a huge range of impacts that can occur, but it's also a thing to stress is that impacts can actually be very difficult to measure. So it's one thing when you have a mass stranding event coinciding with a sonar exercise. I mean, there's kind of a smoking gun in that case, but in many cases, it's not quite so obvious. And there's a lot of things that contribute to that challenge. One is that observing marine animals, again, I'm biased towards whales, but observing marine animals is difficult. If you consider whales, you know, you're observing them at the surface, you know, where maybe they spend 10-20% of their time. So there's an observational limitation. Then you can have noise can have just a temporary effect on an individual. You know, maybe they interrupt a foraging dive, or they change direction, or they change swimming speed, something apparently very minor, but applied to an entire population over a large sort of time and space range can actually translate to a lot of, you know, lost energy or lost reproductive opportunities, or any number of different issues that can translate to like population level disturbance, where you actually have a reduction in reproduction at the population level. So it's a very nuanced and difficult thing that you know, has to be, you need to sort of have a long experimental or sort of observational periods, and be very cautious with your statistics and interpretation in order to sort of parse out all the different contributions and be confident about these impacts.
Yeah,
Lindy?
could I just, yeah, thanks, Fred. Yeah, no, that's such an excellent point, Hansen, and it's one that I keep beating home, is when, you know, oil and gas or the Navy say, well, you know, we didn't see any effects. Well, first of all, how much sensitivity do you have to actually detect those? Because the ocean is not a controlled laboratory. You know, we can't keep everything else the same, right? So there'll be currents, and there'll be upwellings, and there'll be differences in prey ability. And so to find that signal, you know, signal to noise in a statistical sense is really tricky. And then you also have to tie it to just noise, because the animals are dealing with all sorts of other impacts and threats. And to then just say, well, this one is just from noise, that's near impossible. So the noise producers have all the advantage here, in that they can hide behind, you know, well, you know, you can't give us proof, right? So this is where the precautionary principle really comes into its own and has to be used.
Yeah, if I can add a follow-up sort of just anecdote, I think another complicating factor is that we're still grappling to understand the way, the nuance and the sort of complexity with which marine mammals can use sound. For example, there was a really cool study with North Atlantic right whales where they played sounds of North Atlantic right whales to North Atlantic right whales, and they didn't really observe much of a response. But when they played the sounds of southern right whales, virtually the same sound to our ear, there was the the whales exposed to those sounds immediately had an incredibly strong reaction, basically charged the vessel playing those signals. So they really understand very subtle differences in acoustic signaling that, you know, we probably don't, or certainly don't. So it's a fascinating and challenging study area.
Very, very neat. All right, we're circling back to a fourth question, and this one will start with Hansen, but will involve both Haley and Lindy. This one is, how can we reduce or eliminate unwanted anthropogenic, the human-caused noise that we find in the ocean. I'm presuming that if people don't feel obliged to make noise, it's not exactly like setting off fireworks on the 4th of July. As people operate in the ocean in general, we'd be quite happy to eliminate it if we can. Is it actually possible?
Yeah, so I'll touch on a few of the ways that we can mitigate noise impacts. I don't work too much on reducing noise overall. I think Lindy and Haley are more qualified to handle that part of the question. But in terms of reducing the impacts of noise that's already there, there's a few things that you can do. For one, you can try to avoid having noise coincide with marine mammal habitats. So you can try to reroute shipping or reroute seismic exploration, or basically try to move noise away from these important habitat areas. Another thing you can do is, which is common for construction and for seismic activities, is that you can actively work to try to detect animals in the area, and then modify your activity in response to animals nearby. That's challenging because it's easy to miss marine animals, but it is a strategy that's used. You can modify the sound source or remove it. Of course, that's ideal, but you can modify it in some way, because certain marine animals are more sensitive to particular types of sounds that occur at a certain frequency range or a certain volume, or have a certain sort of time frequency spectral characteristic, getting into the signal processing domain. And then another thing that's commonly done is you have a ramp up of sound volume prior to the start or the initiation of generally either construction or I think sonar in many cases, where basically you start the noise at a very low, you start producing noise at a very low volume and then increase that volume over time to try to give marine animals an opportunity to get out of the way. Not a lot of evidence to show that is effective, but it is something that's being used. And yeah, anyway, so those are some of the ways to mitigate impacts. I wonder if maybe Lindy or Haley can talk about some more specific types of noise abatement techniques or other things.
Go ahead, Lindy, and come back to Haley. Yep, Lindy first.
Okay. Well, so for the main 3 S's, shipping, sonar, and seismic, for shipping, as I mentioned, the slowdown as an operational measure, like a short-term measure, that one, a 10% reduction in speed can reduce the noise footprint by 40%. So that's a big win there. Then there's other technological changes that can be made to that. The main thing is to keep that wake field very uniform, so that the propeller isn't dealing with a lot of different pressures as it rotates. So that can all be done in the design phase, preferably, but there can be retrofits as well that can be effective, and also reduce greenhouse gas emissions and fuel costs. Then for seismic, there are alternatives to air guns that I've been pursuing, called there's a marine fiber size, and it spreads the noise from a shot out sort of over time. Again, I think we should be mainly keeping oil and gases on the ground. Like I think from a climate to disaster point of view, we really shouldn't be going that route anyway. And then from sonar, as Hansen mentioned, separating the exercises from the habitats. There are areas in the ocean that are practical deserts, and it would be nice if we could do our sonar trials there. We don't do nuclear tests in rainforests, after all, so that would be, those are some of the main ones. But I will say some of the, I call them window dressing, some of these ramp ups and the observers, the visual observers looking out if there are, marine mammals approaching. I mean, better than nothing, for sure, better than nothing. But really, if you look at the actual effectiveness of it, doesn't get us that far. Mainly what you have to do is quiet the noise. You just got to reduce the source levels, reduce it at source. That's the main thing.
Haley.
Yeah, exactly. Lindy covered what I was going to add there. That's something that we've been doing at Transport Canada. Slowdowns are our main kind of mitigation measure that we've been looking at. And for SRK, or Southern Resident Killer Whale, sorry, I'm in government, so I speak in acronyms now. It's a little change. For Southern Resident Killer Whales, that's obviously been the main goal. But things like for the North Atlantic right whale, when we implemented this large speed restriction measure in the Gulf, I encourage everyone to look at how big this area is. Obviously, that was for kind of vessel strike, but it's kind of been a hand in hand with vessel noise as well. And although we're targeting kind of these main 3 species of whales for transport, it's also improving kind of for all whales in that area as well, because it's not a right whale zone by any means. We see our aerial surveillance sees blue whales, fin whales, all of them. And that's kind of where things are going as well. So I don't think there's much else for me to add other than what Lindy and Hansen had already said.
Very good. All right, so now we have a general question for all of the members of the panel. Actually, it's a suite of little questions that nest to each other's, but where are we, both nationally and internationally, with policies with regards to mitigation of noise in the ocean? Are there missing things that we haven't managed to get adopted, and why haven't they been adopted? Are there blockers that are stopping this from coming in and making this kind of thing happen? And if we don't get it right, what does it mean for the future? So who'd like to take that one on to start?
Okay, I guess I can try.
Go ahead, Lindy.
Yeah, because I have been working in the international fora, which it moves glacially. I mean, absolutely glacially. And, you have anything international, you have constantly national interest trumping, one would have thought the pandemic might have gotten us a little bit more broad thinking, but I don't think humans change that quickly. Anyway, the International Maritime Organization just trying to get, some of these quieting measures introduced there just incredibly slowly. But I think if we do focus on, for that, pile driving is a very good example. That's used to drive the wind farms to the turbines into the ocean floor and in shallow areas anyway. And so pile driving sort of hammers these into the ocean floor. And amazingly, because that is a newer industry, the industry has been very open to quieting measures, like using bubble curtains to keep the noise restricted to a area just around the pile, and in fact has spurred innovation. So there is a case where if you have, like Germany is one of the few countries that actually has noise limits. And if you have those, then, first the noise producers will say, oh, it's impossible, we can't do it. And then you put a regulation in there, and amazingly, it somehow becomes possible. And again, the innovation and the technological alternatives show up. So I think if we are just much more insistent on regulations, and this is also something that I'm working with through the European Union and the Marine Strategy Framework Directive, which is a binding law for the European Union, and it encompasses several marine descriptors, and one of them is noise. And those are, we're trying to come up with targets and thresholds there. And if we can manage that, which again is incredibly slow, then I think we will see some changes because, you know, noise is the classic transboundary pollutant. If we don't all work on this together, we're not going to get very far. So that's just to start things off.
Mm-hmm. Haley?
Yeah, agreed. Domestically as well. It's always great if we have that international push for any sort of domestic regulations, especially if we've signed on to that convention. One thing as well is the collecting evidence that proves that it's noise that are causing these things, like Hansen said, like that's really where it's kind of struggling as well, I find. So we can implement more things, but we need kind of more of the evidence to back it up. And it's funny because it's all connected, right? It's not just singled out for a lot of these things. So I think that and increasing our technology to try and better capture the picture that we're looking at, I think will really help. But I think from a Government of Canada perspective, I guess that we've been doing a decent amount of work to try and get to address it properly, but there is struggles. It doesn't go as slow at the as at the international level, but it's still pretty slow. So,
Hansen, thoughts?
Yeah, the one thought that I have sort of in response to all this, I will be the first to admit that I don't do a lot of work on the policy side, but it seems to me like an obvious solution that can be sort of, or not an obvious part of the solution that can be implemented now is simply to slow ships down. As both Lindy and Haley mentioned, I think Lindy even said this earlier, it's a win-win-win-win, 4 wins. You slow ships down, you have less noise, you have less fuel costs, you have less emissions, and you have lower vessel strike risk to marine mammals. It's just across the board, it makes sense. It's, of course, there's must be an economic component. There's obviously a component involving the sort of timetable of getting, shipping goods around the world. 90% of everything is a commonly quoted figure for what is transported on cargo ships around the world. I mean, it is something that's kind of out of sight and out of mind to many people, but it is an absolutely enormous part of how we live and get the things that we use on a day-to-day basis. But I think that adjustment would be possible to make, maybe especially in coastal oceans, which are already at higher risk for, already louder and at higher risk for noise impacts. Again, I don't really know where the policy hurdles lie in implementing that kind of effort. I don't know, maybe if Lindy and Haley can speak to that in more detail, but that is something that occurs to me as part of a solution that can be implemented soon. And then these other really cool technological improvements can help supplement or offset noise even more.
Yeah, agree, Hansen, too. As for what we can and cannot do, I don't know if you'll notice that sometimes when measures come out, they'll be mandatory versus voluntary, and that has to do where the measures are located for domestic regulation. If I'm looking at my 2 files, kind of with southern resident killer whales and North Atlantic right whales, we've been able to implement, in my opinion, more for North Atlantic right whales just for where it's located in the Gulf of St. Lawrence versus, and where the US border is, versus on the West Coast in the Juan de Fuca Strait, that is half the state's, half ours. So it's been kind of a challenge in that sense when you get close to that boundary that obviously ocean noise ignores, marine species ignore this boundary, but we've put it in place and it kind of restricts us in a way too. One other thing I was thinking of too is having a more proactive response to the changes in the oceans versus what we've kind of been doing, which is reactive. For us, Transport Canada did not touch whales with a 10-foot pole until a bunch of whales washed up dead in 2017. That's reactive, that's not proactive. So looking at where we're looking at right now with climate change, how much shipping is going to be increasing, although our measures may help other species, I think it's time to look more at what other species may need help before they become endangered, basically.
If I could just add one thing, I get a little cranky when rightly, as Haley rightly said, that noise producers require more evidence of impact. Well, when I wrote my report on fish and invertebrate impacts from noise, I came up with over 100 species that have had documented impacts. Then you add the marine mammals, that gets you to 150. Like, really, at what point is it enough, right? I sort of think at 150 species, I think we can safely say it's a problem.
Lindy, that's actually a nice segue into the next phase of this, which is answering some of the questions that are coming in from the audience. The very first one we had was from Beth, wondering about, is there any data on how populations of various marine animals are being affected, i.e. data? And maybe as part of that, who's responsible to collect this data? Is it the people making the noise, or is it just academic researchers who have to bring it to the table and surprise everybody?
I can take that. Yeah, the conflict of interest problem is huge. And I've written several papers on this because it's the noise producers. And if we want to look at why things are also stalled, it's because the main noise producers, oil and gas, big oil, and the US Navy, and thirdly shipping. But the first two are incredibly powerful and have very deep pockets. So getting anything through there is a challenge. And then they also fund noise, which is fantastic. I mean, it should be pollute or pay, but my argument is always at arm's length. Like, you shouldn't have control over how the money is distributed and the research questions that are asked. You need to pretty much throw that money over the fence and have that delegated, to various research groups through an independent body. So that's a problem right there. The U.S. Navy funds 70% of noise research in the U.S. and 50% worldwide. That is a problem. Like, you can't have a major noise producer who is so invested in the results directly funding research like that and having control over it. Sorry, what were the, so the evidence for population effects, very difficult to come by, as we mentioned, and especially for cetaceans, whales and dolphins. You have our estimates for their population sizes are already plus or minus 40%. They're so imprecise. Then you want to, come up with showing a difference in population size when you're starting out with something that's so inexact to start with, and then again you have to tie it to noise. And there's basically, I can't come up with too many stressors or threats where you just have one that affects a population. Like, there are a few cases where you can have bycatch and the vaquita, that is the major threat, but there aren't many. Usually the animals are dealing with a whole host of threats. And the way these threats all interact is often multiplicative. It's not additive. And so then you have, way more than the sum of the parts is being affected, and the animals having to deal with that. So these are all huge problems for finding population effects of noise. But there still have been some, especially I can count for fish and shipping noise and sonar and beaked whales. There have been there is some evidence of population impact, but it's hard to come by.
So the next question is really targeted at Haley and Hansen, It's from Andrew, and it's about slower ships make lower noise levels but stay in the area for longer. The end result is a shift in the distribution of noise with lower levels over a longer period, not an overall reduction in noise. So are we actually better off if we start slowing the ships down?
Do you want to take that? I can just speak to that. I mean, Andrew is an expert on ocean noise and the impacts on cetaceans, so he's definitely right with this statement. There's not it's not entirely clear that lower noise over a longer period is quote unquote better. I mean, there's definitely more work that has to be done in that domain for sure. But I think the other benefits still stand to slowing ships down. And I would have to look into that in some more detail, but perhaps Andrew has that detail.
Actually, it is an important question, but it's actually pretty straightforward. Speed only increases linearly, but exposure, the area exposed, increases by the cubed root. Or cubed. So in fact, it still is better to slow down. That question actually has been answered just by sheer math.
Right.
And just to hop in as well, absolutely, Andrew, I'm not going to get into that debate. You guys can have that. One thing that we have been doing on the East Coast, though, is so with if you're familiar, I'm pretty sure, Andrew, you are, that with the static speed restriction zone, we do have our dynamic highway is kind of what we call it, which was placed where the traffic separation scheme is in the Gulf. And this is an area where we don't expect aggregations of right whales and kind of where vessels can go a bit faster. But if a right whale is spotted, then we do put in a speed restriction. So we're actually kind of encouraging industry unofficially to use the highway instead of cutting through. Not only does it save them time, but it also moves them away from that big aggregation that's in the bottom, which would also move the noise away, if that made any sense.
So next general question from Elwin: should noise pollution be included in an ocean governance policy management system? Lindy, maybe you're best. Maybe I already know what you're going to say.
Definitely, yeah, because well, if you manage for noise, in fact, you get a lot of other threats covered as well, because noise travels so far. So, for instance, you manage a marine protected area for noise, you'll have to have buffer zones, and that'll increase the area, because it's no good having a marine protected area and then a noise source right outside of it, because the noise will come right in. So if we manage for noise, in fact, we're often helping other aspects of protection as well. But I do think it is a form of pollution that's under the UN has defined it as such, and so it needs to be part of any good management plan.
Very good. Question to Haley. You mentioned that the slowdown measures in the Gulf of St. Lawrence will help other species regarding strikes and impacts from noise. How is that being measured? And when support to carcasses of non-right whale species are not supposed to be investigated?
Yep. Unfortunately, yeah. With any sort of necropsy for other species, there is a funding issue for sure. Can't argue with that at all. There isn't a lot being done for other species, which is what I was kind of saying for steps forward when we look at other species being able to perform those necropsies and seeing the impacts on the non-endangered but endangered species. I don't know if anyone from the panel wants to add to that.
Nope.
Nope.
All right, we'll carry on. From Ernesto, it looks like eliminating the problem is, at least in the short and medium term, not an option unless we have a big technological leap. Then the issue is mitigation. You panelists have mentioned a few possible measures. Is there a combination of them that is the best way to do this? Speed, better shipping routes, technology innovation. Any magic combinations?
I mean, it is funny. We once sat around and said, you know, well, if we had world peace, we wouldn't have the problem of naval sonar. If we bought more locally, we wouldn't have the problem of shipping. And if we got off our oil and gas addiction, air guns would be solved, air gun noise. So, you know, these do have broader implications on society and how we want to, the values that we want to espouse.
Anybody else want to take a kick at that? Hansen, you look like you're ready.
I love that answer. I think it really sort of depends as well on the industry and the sort of technology. I mean, I think that ultimately there has to be both a change in behavior and a change in technology. It's probably hard to get away from both of those things. Yeah, and the change in technologies are probably going to be more long-term in taking effect. And so, yeah, I guess you really need sort of a phased approach of what you can do now, what you can work towards implementing on the technology side, and then sort of behaviorally as far as consumer, modifying consumer behavior and encouraging world peace and stopping climate change. Like they're all quite substantial. So I guess the solution just has to take many different forms. It's difficult to imagine a sort of silver bullet.
Well, in that vein, Jessica noted that there are dynamic fisheries closures for the North Atlantic right whale. Could you do something similar with noise? Identify particularly sensitive periods for the right whales in particular areas, and then shut down those activities, those noise generating activities in those areas in exactly the same way you do for the fisheries?
So maybe I'll jump in with that. Although again, with North Atlantic right whale, it hasn't been, noise wasn't really the reason why we started doing this, but it's also adding to it as we learn more and more about North Atlantic right whales and how they're impacted by noise. What we have done, actually kind of using the dynamic fishery closures for seasonal, so they have temporary and seasonal fishery grid closures. We've actually implemented for the second year a restricted area where vessels are not allowed to go in, and that's to protect that bigger aggregation that happens mid-season. So that was actually just implemented last week on June 14th. Again, the original purpose of it was to kind of make it a vessel no-go zone with exemptions, obviously for safety enforcement and some of the smaller vessels that can't go around it because it's quite a large area. But that is to kind of protect the right whales during that peak time in the season where they are foraging and mating. So it does help. It does prohibit vessels from going in the area and going around. Sound does travel though, so I'm not sure how much it impacts with the noise levels, and that's not something that we're monitoring at this point. At least from a Government of Canada perspective, I'm sure there's some researchers who are working on this. I'll hand it over to the other panelists.
Germany does have different regulations depending on if harbor porpoises are breeding or not. So there, the affected habitat will be less tolerance for exposed habitat when they're breeding. So you can make different regulations depending on sensitive times.
So we just had a question from Janine about the impact of noise on species other than whales. We've spoken a lot about what happens to whales, but What are the known impacts that are coming in for fishes, for marine invertebrates, turtles?
I don't know so much about turtles. There've been like the leatherback does use probably low frequency sounds to orient towards nesting or for migration. But not all that much has been done in turtles. But certainly the 100 species, over 100 that I found in fish and invertebrates have been impacted by noise from shipping noise, seismic surveys. The fisheries, the catch rates can be reduced drastically in seismic surveys. As I said, like filter feeders do not effectively filter as much when they're exposed to noise. And if you add cadmium exposure, then there's a synergistic or multiplicative effect of both noise and cadmium toxicity. Mortality rates 5-fold in scallops exposed to air guns, and zooplankton 2 to 3 times the number of dead zooplanktons. And that's, that is getting to the base of the whole marine food web. So that is a huge, very disturbing effect right there.
Very good. So I see we have a hand raised, Carly Green. I think I've depended on the moderator of the moderator to make sure that Carly is put in and given a chance to speak. So go ahead, Carly.
Hi, yeah, I just figured I would, I guess, ask you guys as opposed to just typing. But first off, great, I guess, webinar and like presentations from all of you. I'm an incoming Master's of Marine Management student for this coming year. So yeah, Haley, it was awesome to hear your perspective on like where you are now. But my question, I guess, I'm sure you guys have heard this probably before, but in terms of, for people who aren't currently researching, these types of topics or aren't even in marine science at all, what is like, I guess, the best step, or what would you recommend for someone in terms of, making the best impact, even if we're not, on ships on a daily basis? What can someone, the average citizen, do every day? Is it mostly about awareness and increasing the education? Is it about, like you guys were talking about, shopping local and obviously those greater impacts of needing less shipping? But yeah, what are the day-to-day things people, like anyone, could be doing, I guess?
Use less, buy less, use less. That's my standard answer. Like we just use way more. We buy way more than we need. We throw away way more. Reuse, don't buy as much, don't be so focused on material goods, and of course, cut down on your oil and gas consumption as well. Bike more, walk more, public transportation.
That's awesome, thanks.
Good question.
We're getting really close to the end, but it suddenly strikes me a question we haven't asked you is, do we actually know how much noise is in Canada's waters? Where are we actually monitoring and developing soundscapes that describe things? I know there's a pretty good system in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, but how about the Atlantic coast? How about the Arctic? How about the Pacific? How much of our coast do we actually have information about noise levels in?
It's not too bad, the coverage. The Arctic coverage is very good. Neptune system in the Pacific is quite good. I mean, we do have a fair amount of sensors out there, but the analysis is always, the huge numbers that are crunched, that are the analysis is often where the backlog happens. So that needs to, be automated more, for instance. Can I just correct one thing? I said something about compared the speed of ships relative to the exposed area because they're taking a longer time. I think I meant it's a 6-fold power between ship speed and noise radiated compared to just linear speed. So I think that's I didn't quite get it right, but it definitely the answer is still the same, that it's still better to slow down even if you might be exposing an area for longer periods.
All right. Well, we've hit the end of the hour. I want to thank the panelists for doing a great job in providing the answers to the questions, clear and very, very helpful. I thank everybody who attended the webinar. I understand that it has been recorded, and I guess we will know in a short time about how it will be made accessible to people to potentially view again in the future. So thank you for that. And beyond that, I guess we may have a few people staying for a few minutes beyond, but if everybody else needs to move on, by all means, thank you very much for your attendance and feel free to log off at this particular point. Ciao.